This doesn't sound like good news, but it is. There's no afterlife. I'll explain why it is good news later, but I'll start by explaining the argument. If you believe in the afterlife, then you believe in the soul. The soul is what leaves the body and continues on in the afterlife. Without the soul, the best the afterlife can offer is a copy of your consciousness. The copy would have your memories and personality, but you wouldn't be the one experiencing their life. So if the soul doesn't exist, then neither does the afterlife. The evidence against the soul comes from many different fields of science, from physics, biology, psychology, and neuroscience. You might be thinking, hey, science can't say anything about the existence of a soul. That's only a question for religion. But that's not actually true. Assuming the existence of the soul is assuming a scientific hypothesis. It is impossible for the soul to have an effect on the brain while also not being measurable by science. Maintaining that the soul plays an active role in our psychological functioning, that it can operate independently from the body, and then trying to argue that these claims are not scientific is a clear case of doublespeak. That is a quote from the book The Soul Fallacy by the cognitive scientist Julian Mussolino. There are many lines of evidence against the soul in this book, but this video will present just one of them. I also have a much longer written essay that summarizes more of the book, if you're curious. So what exactly is a soul? As Mussolino reports, the data from national polls, combined with more detailed studies we conducted with Rutgers students, all point to the same conclusion. Most people in America today believe in a soul that has three core properties. 1. The soul is believed to be immaterial or non-physical, and therefore distinct from the body. 2. The soul is believed to be psychologically potent. It is what gives people their psychological powers, primarily consciousness and the ability to make moral decisions, but also free will, feelings, personality, and our broader ability to make decisions. 3. The soul is believed to be immortal and to carry consciousness into the afterlife. This definition is backed up by data from the US, and while most people around the world believe in the soul, there's obviously a lot of variation in their definitions. But in this essay, I'll be using this definition of the soul because I think it is still general enough to apply to many different soul beliefs. Let's take a look at how one concept of the soul has changed over time. The ancient Greeks thought souls could do a lot of things. They obviously thought you needed a soul to be rational, but also to see what's in front of you and digest food. So all the five senses and the basic functions of life were attributed to souls. But the concept of the soul started to change in the 1600s thanks to the philosopher Descartes. Descartes knew much more about the nerves and veins and organs than the ancient Greeks. He was able to imagine how functions like seeing and digesting food could work physically, which meant they weren't caused by a non-physical soul. So from this knowledge of biology, Descartes was able to shorten the list of what souls could do. We no longer needed those supernatural explanations for how plants and animals grow and how the five senses work. We also used to need supernatural explanations for the weather, the origins of species, and diseases. Humans have a tendency to default to a supernatural explanation for something we don't understand. This is because we don't like unknowns. It is a lot more satisfying to say, a god did it, instead of, I don't know. But this explanation no longer works for things we've been able to scientifically study. We've been able to cross things off the list of what gods are responsible for because of meteorology, evolution, and germ theory. From this perspective, gods are merely the gaps in our knowledge, gaps that are slowly getting smaller and smaller. This slowly shrinking domain of the gods is called the god of the gaps. This concept also applies to the argument for the existence of the soul, despite its diminishing powers. It is merely a soul of the gaps, and it is not a particularly convincing argument for its existence. Descartes was able to fill in some of the unknowns and shrink the soul of the gaps. He crossed off most of the list. But we've learned a lot about the brain since Descartes' time. Let's see how neuroscience has filled in the remaining missing pieces in the soul of the gaps. It isn't controversial to say that the brain makes the body move. There are numerous experiments that show electrical currents are all that is needed to make muscles move. A simple comparison is to the knee-jerk reflex test, where you hit your knee and it moves on its own. That is different from normal motions because it was unintentional. You didn't feel a desire to move before your leg moved. So the soul isn't required for the knee-jerk reflex, but is the soul required to have that feeling of wanting to move? Or is the feeling of intention just a result of the physical brain? A fascinating experiment can answer that question. The team of researchers showed that it is possible to evoke intentions by electrically stimulating the posterior parietal cortex of their patients, which is a certain part of the brain. The patients themselves reported a desire or a will to move and said things like, "I felt a desire to lick my lips," or "I experienced a will to move." Crucially, however, these intentions were not followed by actual actions, nor were they accompanied by activity in the relevant muscles. As the authors themselves explain, they were able to evoke pure intentions. Imagine feeling a strong, specific desire and knowing it was artificially given to you by a machine. I imagine that would be super disorienting, to be directly experiencing that your intentions don't exclusively come from you. This shows that stimulating the brain can push the mind around to make it feel a desire to move. This is direct evidence that an immaterial soul isn't needed to create a feeling of an intention. All that is needed is a little electricity in a physical brain. So it seems we can cross intentions off the list of things we need a soul to do. But maybe intentions are just informed by morality. Let's see if there's any evidence that morality also comes from the brain. An extremely immoral person is said to have no soul. But from other experiments, it seems that even morals come from the brain, not the soul. Our sense of right and wrong can be manipulated using magnets. There's a therapy called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's also called TMS, which of course stands for that magnet stuff. TMS involves putting electromagnets next to a patient's head to create an electrical field in their brain without using surgery. Test subjects were given 25 minutes of TMS to a specific part of their brain and then were asked moral questions about a hypothetical situation. Here's the hypothetical situation. Imagine Grace is getting a cup of coffee for Sarah. Sarah asks for some sugar in hers. Grace notices a white powder by the coffee machine that looks like sugar. The powder is indeed sugar, but it is in a container labeled toxic, and therefore Grace believes that it is toxic. She nevertheless puts some of the powder in Sarah's coffee. Sarah drinks the coffee and is fine because the powder is only sugar. If I were now to ask you to judge Grace's behavior, would you say she committed an act that was morally reprehensible? I hope you would. Our moral intuitions tell us that Grace did something evil because she believed the white powder was a toxic substance, even if it turned out to be harmless. This intuition is reflected in a basic principle of criminal law, that the act is not culpable unless the mind is also guilty. The experiment showed that people that got TMS to a specific part of the brain were more likely to make the opposite moral choice. More of them thought Grace putting a substance she believed to be toxic in her friend's coffee was morally permissible, as long as Sarah didn't actually get hurt. So a procedure to temporarily change a small part of the brain can actually change someone's morals. The moral of the experiment isn't that we can turn otherwise normal individuals into temporary psychopaths, but that the basis of human morality is to be found in the activity of the living brain. If morality was only possible because of a non-physical soul, then it wouldn't be possible to use a physical phenomena like electricity to push the brain around and change someone's morality. But since we can do exactly that, we can also cross morality off the list of the soul's functions. The only thing left on the list is consciousness itself. We can further test the soul hypothesis by seeing if brain activity corresponds to certain conscious states. If consciousness takes place in the immaterial medium of the soul, then it should be utterly inaccessible to materialistic neuroscience. But the advanced brain scanner, called fMRI, allows us to see how the brain functions much more clearly. And the key question is, can patterns of brain activity detected by an fMRI scanner be used to predict temporal sequence recorded for each subject? In other words, Can someone's stream of consciousness be read by a machine? Recent work on brain readings showed that this is indeed possible. In one study, for example, a group of researchers had subjects view pictures of human faces, cats, and an assortment of man-made objects, houses, chairs, scissors, shoes, and bottles, as well as scrambled images, as a control. While their brains were being scanned in an fMRI machine, the million-dollar question was whether each category of stimulus would evoke a distinct pattern of brain response. If so, it would be possible to infer from the pattern of the brain activity the type of picture that the subjects were seeing in their mind's eye. Let me look at your brain and I'll tell you whether you were viewing a face or a house, a shoe or a pair of scissors, a bottle or a chair. The results reveal that overall, the categories being viewed by the subjects were correctly identified 96% of the time on the basis of patterns of brain activity alone. If conscious perceptions take place in the immaterial soul, such feats of mind reading should be simply impossible. The important lesson is that if the contents and temporal dynamics of the mind can be deciphered by analyzing patterns of physical activity in the brain, it is difficult to maintain that conscious awareness takes place in the immaterial medium of the soul. So that is crossed off everything on the list. Each of them can be demonstrated to be the physical workings of the brain. It was already obvious that the brain, not the soul, is responsible for the perception of sight. Now, considering these experiments, it also becomes clear that the brain is what gives us consciousness, not the soul. If intentions, morals, and consciousness came from the soul, not the brain, then we would get completely different outcomes from these experiments. We would have seen results showing that people's intentions weren't changed by some electricity added to the brain. Moral decisions wouldn't have been changed by magnets, and conscious perceptions shouldn't have been detectable in the brain by an fMRI. If the soul was responsible for those perceptions, then they wouldn't be taking place in the physical brain. And if the soul doesn't do any of those things, then it isn't needed to explain anything, and in fact, doesn't exist. It's a pretty wild claim, especially to be made in such a short essay. But if this one argument makes you curious, just know that there are many more that Mussolino makes in his book. I've also summarized more of his arguments in a longer written essay that I've linked to below. I've discussed the evidence coming from neuroscience, but he also draws on psychology, the physical sciences, and biology to make a strong case that is reinforced with evidence from many angles. Mussolino compares this to a detective building a strong criminal case from many different pieces of evidence. Each piece of evidence on its own isn't enough to prove guilt, but when you lay them all out together, it comes to an undeniable conclusion. In the book, he also responds to what is held up as evidence for the soul, and that evidence is shown to be lacking. Mussolino sums up the full argument of the book by saying, if there is no positive evidence supporting dualism, if modern science renders the doctrine untenable, if it is explanatorily impotent, and if all the evidence points towards materialism instead, then it is time to acknowledge what reason is trying to tell us. There is most likely no soul. But is this just a weird fringe theory? After all, the overwhelming majority of people believe in the soul. Well, let's take a look at the professional opinion of leading scientists, specifically the National Academy of Sciences. Their members were asked if they believed in human immortality. In 1914, only 35% said they believed in it. That number dropped to 18% in 1933, and then to 7.9% in 1998. That's quite a staggering consensus. But Mussolino makes an important point, that this is of course not meant to denigrate lay people, but simply to remind ourselves that not everyone is a professional scientist, and that science has important lessons to teach us all. So this means that the people saying that the soul doesn't exist aren't just a few kooky theorists. It's actually 92.1% of leading scientists. I imagine that even after seeing all the evidence, some argue in support of the soul because living without a soul seems terrifying. Which is why the last section of this essay is about how this is nothing to be afraid of, and it is actually good news. Accepting that the soul doesn't exist and that there is no afterlife doesn't mean that life is meaningless. Quite the opposite. Mussolino ends his book by describing the three gifts of the soulless life. 1. The experience of being dead is nothing to be afraid of. Even without a soul, dying still sucks. You'll no longer be able to learn another language or do anything else you were putting off, and your loved ones will miss you. But there is good news about death when you've given up on the idea of the soul. You no longer need to worry about what the afterlife will hold, since it won't feel like anything. What it will feel like to be dead is like what it felt like before being alive. People think a lot about their afterlife, but not their pre-life. Pre-life, you didn't feel cold, lonely, miserable, or anything at all. And you also won't feel anything in death. If unconsciousness is a preview of death, then I'm certainly not afraid of being dead, and neither should you. Gift number 2. Our time is meaningful because of its limit. Imagine you are on vacation for what you think is going to be a whole month in paradise. If it turns out that you'll have to cut your vacation short, would you want to know that? Maybe you were planning on relaxing the first 2 weeks before exploring the last 2 weeks. I'd certainly want to know that so I could make use of the little time I had. Knowing how limited your chances are to experience something will motivate you to actually go do it. That's why the second gift of giving up the soul comes from the understanding that we are mortal creatures and that our lives are therefore finite. This realization offers us the gift of meaningfulness. Time is valuable to us precisely because we do not have an infinite amount of it. With only a finite future ahead of us, we can make rational choices about how to spend our time in ways that are meaningful to us. Gift number 3, freedom. The third gift, perhaps the most important of all, is the gift of freedom that comes from adopting the principles of science and reason. Unlike religion, science does not have the pretension to tell us what we should find meaningful. It just tells us that meaning doesn't necessarily come from above. Moreover, the gift of freedom gives us free rein to decide for ourselves, with or without the help of sacred books, what should matter to us and how we should live our lives. So those are the 3 gifts we get from accepting that souls don't exist. When combined, these gifts form the basis of an empowering alternative to the soul narrative. We can always try to pray our problems away, or tell ourselves that all will be redressed in the afterlife. But in addition to being misguided, this approach is also a recipe for avoiding our responsibilities here and now. As history testifies, it is within our collective power to bring about meaningful change. Slaves, people of color, women, and gays and lesbians did not have to wait for their souls to be rescued by God. Their lives were made better not by the promise of eternal bliss, but by other men and women, believers and non-believers, who took it upon themselves to act in the present. Let go of the soul, and the entire edifice comes crashing down. But this act of apparent destruction is in fact part of a larger and much more meaningful act of creation. As finite, physical, and mortal creatures, we are not infallible, and there are times when we need to acknowledge our mistakes and correct them. Only through this process of self-correction and improvement, 2 of the hallmarks of scientific thinking, can progress on a large scale truly take place. As things stand, the idea of the soul may offer some comfort to those who cannot bear the idea of one day no longer existing. But this illusory comfort rests on false hopes and comes at an enormous societal price that we all have to pay. Far from being the positive idea that it is portrayed to be, the notion of the soul is actually what stands in the way of progress in a much more just society, one in which needless anguish and suffering could be avoided. In finally freeing ourselves from the shackles of superstition, we can look at the future with hope and confidence. The new worldview that replaces the old one is indeed better and wiser. You can bet your life on it. That is how Mussolino ends his book. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I'd recommend you checking out my longer written version of the essay or just reading the book yourself. There's a lot more evidence against the idea of the soul. There's also a lot more to say about where this idea takes you, which I talk about in the other videos on this channel. Check them out too if you're curious. Thanks for watching.